A mighty empire vanished without a single battle cry. The Hittite Empire, a Bronze Age superpower, simply disappeared, leaving behind empty cities and a mystery that puzzled historians for centuries. But now, science is uncovering the truth. By the end of this, you will understand how a silent killer toppled a civilization. We will follow clues hidden in ancient tree rings and deep within lake beds to reconstruct a catastrophe. What does it take for an entire society to unravel? Their capital city, Hattusa, was a fortress of legend. Imagine walls of stone and earth that snaked across the hills for miles, gates guarded by colossal stone lions and sphinxes, and a grand royal citadel overlooking a city teeming with life. This was the heart of an empire built not just on conquest, but on brilliant administration. They were pioneers of constitutional law, establishing some of the earliest known legal codes. Their diplomats negotiated history's first recorded peace treaty with their great rival, Egypt, a fragile accord carved into clay and silver. This was a civilization at its zenith, a complex society of farmers, artisans, priests, and soldiers, all connected by a web of roads and a command of the new technology of iron. For centuries, their power seemed unshakable. Their scribes meticulously recorded everything, from royal decrees to grain shipments, creating a mountain of clay tablets that give us a vivid window into their world. They were a fixture of the Bronze Age landscape, as permanent as the mountains of Anatolia themselves, which makes what happened next so profoundly unsettling. The flow of official records, the chronicles of kings, the meticulous accounts of trade, they all just stop. The great silence that followed this peak of power is the core of the mystery, a void that swallowed a superpower whole. The sudden silence from Hattusa was deafening. One day, the king was dictating letters to Egypt, discussing shipments of grain and military support. The next, there was nothing. The great archives fell quiet, and the city itself was left empty. When archaeologists first peeled back the layers of time, they did not find the evidence of a great war they expected. They found ash, yes, but not the kind that blankets a city after a systematic sack. There were no mass graves of fallen defenders, no shattered weapons littering the streets from a final, desperate stand. The mighty walls of Hattusa were not broken down by battering rams, they were simply abandoned. This was not a murder scene with a clear culprit. It was as if the entire population had simply walked away, leaving their homes and their history to the elements. For generations, this void bred theories. Perhaps a massive, unrecorded invasion swept through, one so complete it left no trace. Maybe a bloody civil war tore the empire apart from within. Or could a sudden, devastating plague have wiped out the population? Yet each of these ideas had a fatal flaw, a piece of the puzzle that did not quite fit. An invasion would have left some mark on the landscape or in the records of neighboring kingdoms. A civil war would have likely produced a new ruler who would have started writing records again. A plague might explain the silence, but not the complete and permanent abandonment of a capital built over centuries. The mystery was a locked room, and the key was nowhere to be found. This profound lack of a satisfying answer is what forced historians to look for clues in entirely new places, setting the stage for a detective story that would shift from dusty libraries to the heart of ancient forests and the depths of forgotten lakebeds. The clues were not in the ruins of the city, but hidden within the gnarled trunks of ancient juniper trees. Deep in the highlands of Anatolia, scientists took core samples from these living relics, and within their rings lay a climatic chronicle stretching back over 3,000 years. Each ring is a perfect timestamp, a record of a single year's weather. A wide ring means a year of plentiful rain and abundant sunshine, a time of growth and prosperity. A narrow, pinched ring tells a far darker story. The data revealed a stark and shocking pattern. Starting around the year 1200 BC, the trees began to tell a tale of unrelenting hardship. Year after year, the rings became desperately thin, a clear signal of a profound and prolonged drought. This was not a single bad season or even a few difficult years. This was a climate catastrophe unfolding over decades, an invisible siege that no army could fight. The very foundation of the Hittite Empire was agriculture. Their society, their cities, and their massive army were all built on a surplus of grain. A drought lasting for a generation would have systematically starved the empire from the inside out. The trees bore silent witness to a famine so vast and so deep that it could cripple a superpower. This was the first solid evidence that the empire's downfall was not a swift, dramatic event, but a slow, grinding collapse. How could any civilization, no matter how powerful, withstand an enemy that dried up its rivers and withered its fields for 20 years? The mystery was deepening, shifting from a question of who destroyed the Hittites to a question of how they could have possibly survived. The trees told a story of thirst, but the earth itself held a second, more damning piece of evidence. Far from the Hittite heartland, at the bottom of ancient lakes and on the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, scientists extracted long cores of accumulated mud. These layered columns of sediment are like a history book written in dirt, with each page representing a single year, and within those pages they found a geochemical fingerprint, a hidden code left by the very water that fell from the sky millennia ago. By analyzing the precise ratio of different oxygen atoms trapped in the sediment, researchers could reconstruct ancient rainfall patterns. This ratio acts as a natural thermometer and rain gauge. The results were unequivocal. The data painted a picture of a climate system in collapse, confirming the tale of the tree rings with brutal geochemical certainty. This was not a local dry spell. It was a regional mega-drought, a catastrophe that gripped the entire eastern Mediterranean for generation after generation. Think of your own garden during a long, hot summer. The soil becomes hard and cracked, and even the hardiest plants begin to wilt and die. Now magnify that image across an entire empire, year after year for 20 or 30 years. The grain stores would have been emptied. The herds of cattle and sheep, essential for food and wealth, would have perished. A society built entirely on the abundance of the harvest had no defense against an enemy that turned the sky to brass and the earth to dust. This slow-moving disaster required no swords and left no visible scars on the city walls, yet it was more destructive than any army. How does a government respond when its entire economic and social foundation simply crumbles away? The answer would lead to the empire's final, desperate act. The silent testimony of the trees and the mud was now echoed by the hollow ruins on the ground. As archaeologists excavated Hittite provincial centers, they uncovered a third and perhaps most poignant clue: the empire's vast central granaries. These were not just storehouses, they were the very bedrock of imperial power, massive state-run silos designed to hold a multi-year surplus of grain. In a good year, they were filled to the brim, a strategic reserve against a single bad harvest. But when scientists examined these granaries from the empire's final days, they found them systematically and completely empty. There was no evidence of a violent raid, no charred marks from a torch, no scattered grain from a hurried looting. The stores had been carefully, methodically consumed down to the last kernel. This was not a sudden catastrophe, it was a slow, bureaucratic unraveling. It tells the story of a government desperately rationing its last reserves, season after season, hoping against hope for the rains to return. Think of a family slowly eating through every last can of food in the pantry during a long winter, watching the shelves grow barer each week. Now magnify that dread to the scale of an entire empire. The empty granaries are a heartbreaking record of that final, futile battle. The state's ultimate insurance policy had been cashed in, and there was nothing left. With a central food supply gone, the social contract that held the empire together would have shattered. Why would farmers stay to work fields that produced only dust? Why would soldiers remain loyal to a king who could not feed them? The great migration away from the cities was not a choice. It was the only option left. The people did not abandon Hattusa in a single day. They were bled away drop by drop by an unrelenting thirst. Putting all the evidence together, the Mega-Drought hypothesis forms a terrifyingly complete picture. The story told by the thin tree rings, the chemical fingerprints in the lake mud, and the echoing emptiness of the granaries is one and the same. This was not a collapse from the outside in, but from the ground up. The real enemy was invisible, a fundamental shift in the climate that turned a fertile empire into a dust bowl over the course of a generation. The Hittite Empire and many of its Bronze Age neighbors were brought down by a creeping, insidious force we would now recognize as catastrophic climate change. This scientific narrative completely rewrites the end of their story, challenging the romantic idea of a dramatic, violent fall. There was no single climactic battle, no final heroic stand. Instead, the empire succumbed to a protracted crisis, a slow-motion disaster that systematically eroded every pillar of its society. Imagine the sheer frustration of the Hittite king. He commands the most powerful army in the region. His scribes can draft complex treaties, and his engineers can fortify mountains. Yet he is utterly powerless against the sky. Year after year, his messengers would have brought the same devastating report from the provinces. The wheat is stunted, the rivers are shallow, and the people are hungry. His treasury, once filled with gold and grain, is slowly depleted as he tries to feed a starving population from dwindling reserves. The political and economic foundations of his power are not shattered by a hammer blow, but are quietly washed away, grain by grain, by the unrelenting drought. This is a far more complex and arguably more chilling reality than any invasion. It forces us to ask a difficult question. How does any civilization, no matter how advanced, defend itself against a changing world? The Hittites had all the trappings of a superpower, but their entire existence was built on a fragile assumption that the rains would always come. When that assumption failed, the entire intricate structure came tumbling down. The silent killer was not a foreign army, but the very environment that had nurtured them for centuries. The Hittite Empire's struggle was not an isolated tragedy. Those same thin tree rings and the chemical story in the mud tell a chillingly similar tale, from the mountaintop palaces of the Mycenaeans in Greece to the bustling ports of the Levant. The entire Eastern Mediterranean world, a network of rich and powerful kingdoms, was faltering at the exact same time. Historians call this era the Late Bronze Age collapse, a period when the lights of civilization seemed to blink out one by one across the ancient world. The fall of the Hittites was not a solo act. It was a single, devastating symptom of a much wider sickness. Think of it like a network of cities all powered by the same electrical grid. If a massive, sustained power surge hits the entire grid, every city will go dark, not because of individual failures, but because of a single, system-wide overload. The climate crisis was that overload. A mega-drought does not respect political borders. It would have withered the wheat fields that fed the Hittite army, just as it parched the olive groves that were the lifeblood of Mycenaean trade. It would have caused famine from Anatolia to the Nile Delta, disrupting the intricate web of commerce that bound these empires together. When one kingdom could no longer export its grain or import the tin needed to make bronze, the economic shockwaves would have rippled through them all, creating a domino effect of failure. This changes the entire narrative of the collapse. It was not a case of one empire falling and its neighbors swooping in to pick over the remains. Instead, they were all facing the same existential threat simultaneously, each one drowning in its own slow-moving disaster, too overwhelmed to offer help or to conquer the other. The real story of the late Bronze Age collapse is not a story of invasions and wars, though those certainly happened in the chaos. It is the story of a connected world coming undone because the environmental foundation that supported it all was pulled away. The silence that fell over Hattusa was just one echo in a chorus of silence that fell across the ancient world. This interconnected world was a masterpiece of ancient logistics. To forge the bronze that gave the era its name, the Hittites needed tin, a metal that often traveled over thousands of miles from distant mines in Afghanistan. Copper arrived from Cyprus, luxury goods like ivory and glass came from Egypt and Mesopotamia, and all of it moved along precarious routes by donkey, caravan, and ship. The Hittite Empire was not a self-sufficient fortress. It was a central hub in a vast, bustling network of exchange. Its strength was derived from this web of trade and diplomacy, a system that brought wealth, information, and technological ideas flowing into the heart of Anatolia. This globalized system was their greatest achievement, but it would also become their single greatest weakness. A house of cards is remarkably stable until the table it rests upon is shaken. The Mega-Drought was that violent shake. It did not just strike the Hittite farmlands, it was a regional catastrophe, meaning every link in their supply chain was suffering the exact same crisis simultaneously. The kingdom that supplied their tin was also facing famine and social unrest. The seafaring traders who transported the copper were dealing with port cities that could no longer afford to pay for goods. One by one, the connections were severed. Imagine a modern city where the power grid fails, the internet goes down, and the highways collapse all at once. Society does not grind to a halt because of one failure, but because the interconnected systems that support it all fail together. That was the Bronze Age collapse. The Hittite king, sitting in his capital, would have seen his world shrinking alarmingly. First, the shipments of tin would have slowed to a trickle, making it impossible to equip his army with new weapons. Then, the diplomatic letters from allied kingdoms would have become increasingly desperate, asking for aid he could no longer provide before falling silent altogether. The trade routes that were the empire's lifelines were cut not by invaders but by emptiness and collapse. The very interdependence that had allowed their civilization to flourish now accelerated its downfall. A local famine is a disaster a strong state can potentially manage, but a famine that strikes every trading partner at the same time is a catastrophe with no solution. Their house of cards did not just fall over, the entire floor beneath it gave way. A powerful state is like a rope woven from many strands. For the Hittites, those strands were the diverse peoples and distant provinces bound together by the authority of the king in Hattusa. This centralized system worked brilliantly when the royal granaries were full and the king's army was strong, but as the drought tightened its grip, that rope began to fray. The very structure that gave the empire its strength now became its greatest vulnerability. Local governors in far-off territories faced an impossible choice. Do they send their last remaining grain to a capital that seems powerless to help them, or do they keep it to feed their own starving families? In such desperate times, loyalty becomes a luxury few can afford. We can picture a regional governor watching his own people suffer, deciding to seal his granaries and stop answering the king's demands. This was not necessarily an act of rebellion, but one of survival. One by one, the outlying regions would have effectively seceded, turning inward to face the crisis alone. The empire did not shatter from a single blow. It unraveled strand by strand as local self-interest overrode imperial command. The king in Hattusa would have found his orders echoing in an ever-shrinking territory. His power, which once stretched from coast to coast, was now limited to the land he could see from his citadel walls. The political unity that had taken centuries to build dissolved in just a few hungry years. The drought did not create these internal divisions, but it poured a relentless stress test upon them, and the structure failed. What happens to a kingdom when every town is forced to become its own fortress, hoarding its last scraps of food? It ceases to be a kingdom at all. For generations, the story needed a villain, and history provided one: the Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian reliefs and inscriptions carved into temple walls depict a chaotic struggle against a confederation of mysterious invaders from across the sea. They show ships capsizing and foreign warriors being defeated, a powerful propaganda message from the pharaohs who claimed to have saved civilization from the abyss. It was a compelling narrative, a single, shadowy enemy to blame for the darkness that fell across the entire Bronze Age world. The logic seemed unassailable. If the mighty Hittite Empire was gone, surely a cataclysmic invasion must have been the cause. These sea peoples became the convenient scapegoat, a marauding horde that swept in from the Mediterranean to burn, pillage, and erase empires. But a story carved in stone is not always the whole truth. When archaeologists meticulously sifted through the ruins of Hattusa and other major Hittite centers, they made a puzzling discovery. They could not find the evidence that should have been everywhere. Where were the layers of widespread destruction ash that would signal a city put to the torch by an invading army? Where were the mass graves, the streets littered with the distinctive weapons of foreign warriors, the signs of a prolonged siege? The city was abandoned, not demolished. This glaring lack of evidence at the very heart of the empire forces a dramatic rethink. The Sea Peoples were real, but they were likely not the cause of the collapse. They were its consequence. Imagine the coastal towns and smaller kingdoms around the Mediterranean, all suffering under the same decades-long drought that was starving the Hittites. Their fields failed, their freshwater sources dried up, and their societies fractured. What options remained for these desperate populations? The sea became their only escape route. They were not a unified army of destruction, but a flotilla of refugees, displaced peoples, and opportunistic migrants pushed onto the waves by the same climatic catastrophe. They were not the hurricane itself, but the debris flung into the air by the storm. When these desperate groups eventually clashed with the weakened but still standing kingdoms like Egypt, it was a symptom of the wider systemic failure, not its root cause. They were fleeing a disaster, not creating one. This reframing changes everything. The fall of the Hittites was not a military defeat inflicted by an external foe. It was a societal collapse from within, triggered by an environmental crisis that created a wave of human desperation, a wave that history would mistakenly remember as an army. The archaeology of the capital city, Hattusa, reveals a scene not of chaos but of quiet, heartbreaking finality. The city gates were not smashed open by invaders, they were simply left open. The grand temples and palaces were not burned to the ground, they were carefully emptied and left to the slow decay of wind and rain. When archaeologists first walked these silent streets, they found a puzzle. The most valuable objects, the gold, the royal seals, the official state records, were all gone. This was not the result of a panicked flight. It points to a planned, orderly evacuation. The people took what they could carry and what mattered most, leaving behind only the immovable shells of their buildings. It was a conscious, collective decision to walk away from a home that could no longer be a home. Yet in this orderly departure, there is one last poignant clue of defiance. The city's massive walls, the very symbol of Hittite power, show signs of a final, desperate reinforcement. Workers hastily added new fortifications, a last-ditch effort to make the stronghold seem impregnable. But here is the critical detail. There is no evidence that these reinforced walls were ever tested in battle. No siege ramps were built against them. No volleys of enemy arrows were found embedded in the stone. The walls stood strong, but they were defending a city that was already dying from within. This peaceful yet tragic departure tells us everything. The people were not running from an army at the gates. They were surrendering to a far more inexorable foe. The land itself had turned against them, and the once fertile valleys around the capital could no longer yield enough food to sustain a metropolis. The city's end was a long, drawn-out whimper, not a sudden, dramatic bang. It was the sound of a civilization accepting its fate, closing the door gently behind them as they left their great capital to the silence. So where did millions of Hittite people go when their world dissolved? The collapse of the state did not mean the extinction of its people. Instead, it triggered a vast and silent refugee crisis, a diaspora that scattered a civilization across the ancient landscape. Imagine the difficult journeys of individual families, packing whatever they could carry and leaving their ancestral homes behind, not for opportunity but for simple survival. Some populations moved southeast, seeking refuge in the fringes of the empire that were less severely affected by the drought. In the regions of modern-day Syria and northern Iraq, we see a fascinating echo of their culture emerge centuries later. Small but powerful city-states, which archaeologists call the Neo-Hittite states, rose to prominence. These were not the resurrected Hittite Empire, but they were its cultural descendants. Their rulers carved inscriptions in a language derived from that of the Hittite kings, and their art and architecture preserved distinct Hittite styles, a ghost of the old empire living on in a new form. Other displaced Hittites likely integrated into the populations of neighboring lands, their identity slowly blending over generations, and some, pushed to the brink, may have taken to ships or joined the roving bands, becoming part of that very same wave of human desperation that history would later call the Sea Peoples. This scattering is the most human dimension of the collapse. It reminds us that the fall of an empire is not an abstract event. It is the story of millions of individuals, farmers, artisans, and scribes, suddenly transformed into stateless refugees in a world that was coming apart at the seams. The evidence is compelling, but how can we truly see the weather patterns of 3,000 years ago? This is not a matter of simple speculation. Modern science has unlocked a remarkable tool for time travel, the climate model. To reconstruct the ancient skies, scientists begin with the raw data, the physical testimonies we have already explored. The precise widths of tree rings, the chemical isotopes locked in lakebed mud, and the layers of ice in distant glaciers all serve as proxy data. These are not direct weather reports, but they are powerful stand-ins, natural archives that record the conditions of their time. Think of each of these data points as a single pixel in a vast historical photograph. On its own, one thin tree ring tells you it was a dry year in one forest. But when you combine thousands of these pixels from trees, lake beds, and ice cores across the entire region, a startlingly clear image begins to emerge. This is where the computer models come in. Researchers feed this massive collection of proxy data into sophisticated programs that simulate the Earth's entire climate system. These digital laboratories can process the complex interactions between the ocean, the atmosphere, and the land. They can show how a slight shift in sea surface temperatures or a change in prevailing wind patterns could have rerouted the rain clouds that once watered the Hittite heartland for generations. The model does not just confirm the drought happened, it shows us the mechanics of the disaster, illustrating how a stable climate could tip into a new, arid state and remain there for decades. This transforms the story from a historical mystery into a quantifiable climatic event. We are no longer just guessing at the cause of the collapse. We are watching it unfold in a digital recreation, seeing with our own eyes the invisible forces that rewrote human destiny. The fall of a superpower becomes a tragic case study in the fragile relationship between civilization and the environment it depends upon. What other lost chapters of history might these same tools be able to read from the silent language of the earth itself? The fate of the Hittites echoes across centuries and continents, a recurring nightmare in human history. Far from the Anatolian plateau, the magnificent Maya cities of Central America were also swallowed by the jungle after centuries of prosperity. Their towering pyramids and sprawling plazas were abandoned in an eerily similar fashion, not to invaders but to silence. For a long time, the collapse of the Maya was a profound enigma, until climate scientists looked deep into lake sediments and cave formations. There they found the same ghost that haunted the Hittites, a relentless multi-generational drought that starved their intricate agricultural systems. The Maya, masters of mathematics and astronomy, were just as vulnerable to a shifting climate as any Bronze Age empire. Their society, intensely dependent on seasonal rains for their complex maize-based agriculture, could not withstand a century of failing monsoons. Across the globe and even further back in time, the Akkadian Empire of ancient Mesopotamia met the same fate. This was the world's first true empire, a pioneer of centralized power that unified the city-states of the Fertile Crescent. Its fall was so complete that later generations believed the gods had cursed the land. Modern science has uncovered a more tangible curse. Analysis of dust deposits from the Gulf of Oman revealed a catastrophic drought around 4,200 years ago, a drought so severe it left the very heartland of civilization barren. The Akkadian Empire, built on the bounty of the Tigris and Euphrates, crumbled when that bounty disappeared. When we place the Hittite collapse alongside these other great failures, a terrifying pattern emerges. It is a pattern of fragility. Each of these civilizations shared common vulnerabilities. They were all heavily reliant on intensive, centralized agriculture. They all developed complex, hierarchical political structures that required a massive surplus of food to sustain priests, soldiers, and administrators. And in each case, their political and economic systems proved too rigid to adapt when the environmental rules of the game changed permanently. They were optimized for a specific climate, and when that climate vanished, their entire societal blueprint became obsolete. This transforms the Hittite story from a singular tragedy into a vital data point in a global study of human resilience. It forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Environmental change has been one of the most powerful and consistent drivers of civilizational failure throughout our entire history. The question is no longer why one empire fell, but why this pattern keeps repeating itself. Yet the end of the empire was not the end of the people. Even as the great capital of Hattusa fell silent, the flame of Hittite culture was not extinguished. It simply moved, carried by the very refugees and migrants who fled the drought-stricken heartland. Far to the southeast, in the hills and plains of what is now Syria and southern Turkey, that flame found new fuel. Here, a constellation of smaller but vibrant city-states rose from the ashes of imperial collapse. Modern scholars call them the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, and for several more centuries they kept the old world alive. These were not the resurrected Hittite Empire, but they were unmistakably its cultural children. In cities like Carchemish and Malatia, the old ways persisted with a stubborn resilience. Scribes continued to carve public monuments and royal decrees using the distinctive, elegant symbols of Luwian hieroglyphs, the same script once used by their imperial forebears. Stonemasons sculpted reliefs of powerful gods and protective sphinxes, their style a direct echo of the art that once adorned the gates of Hattusa. The gods themselves, the storm god Tahunza and the sun goddess Arina, were still worshipped in temples that upheld traditions centuries old. This cultural persistence reveals a crucial distinction we often overlook. A political state with its armies and central bureaucracy can be incredibly fragile, collapsing under the weight of a single, sustained crisis. But a culture, the shared language, beliefs, and artistic spirit of a people, is a far more durable thing. It can survive the death of the state that once nurtured it. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms were living proof that the empire's true legacy was not its political borders, but the identity of its people. They became threads of Hittite tradition, slowly woven into the rich and complex tapestry of the ancient Near East, influencing their neighbors and leaving a subtle but permanent mark on the world that came after. The silent collapse of a Bronze Age superpower holds up a dark mirror to our own world. The Hittites were brought down not by a foreign army, but by a failure of their most basic life support system, the climate that fed them. That same vulnerability is woven into the fabric of our modern global civilization, only on a scale the Hittites could never have conceived. Our supply chains stretch across oceans, our megacities house tens of millions, and our food production is concentrated in a handful of breadbasket regions. A climate shock in one of these critical areas does not just mean a local shortage, it sends ripples of disruption through the entire global network. The Hittites faced a regional drought, but we are now engineering a global one, and our interconnectedness means a single point of failure can have cascading consequences. Think of the intricate logistics required to stock a single supermarket. The produce, the grains, the packaged goods, they all arrive from different corners of the world, a just-in-time delivery system that operates with breathtaking efficiency. Now, imagine a prolonged drought in a major agricultural region, or a series of catastrophic floods that wipe out key transport hubs. The empty shelves in that local store would be a tiny echo of the Hittites' vast, empty granaries, a symptom of a system under profound stress. The Hittite story shows us that environmental change is rarely the sole cause of collapse. Instead, it acts as a threat multiplier, placing immense pressure on every crack in a society's foundation. It takes existing social inequalities, political instability, and economic fragilities, and it supercharges them. A society already struggling with division will find those divisions ripped wide open when resources become scarce. The Hittite governors who stopped sending grain to the capital were making a rational choice in a world of scarcity, a choice that fractured their political unity. Can we be certain our own complex systems of governance and international cooperation would fare any better under similar, unrelenting strain? Their catastrophe is a 3,000-year-old lesson in resilience, or the lack of it. It forces a difficult question upon us. With all our advanced technology and scientific knowledge, have we truly built a civilization that is more resilient than theirs? Or have we merely built one that is far more complex and therefore far more fragile when the foundations begin to shake? That phrase, "the day the empire disappeared," is a powerful but misleading piece of shorthand. It suggests a single, thunderous event, a final hour when everything ended. The scientific evidence paints a far more protracted and terrifying picture. This was not an apocalypse but an erosion. There was no single day of reckoning, only a relentless succession of bad years. One failed harvest could be weathered, two would strain the system, but after 5, 10, or 20 years of dwindling rains and stunted grain, the very spirit of the empire began to fray. Think of it not as a building being struck by lightning, but as a foundation slowly sinking into soft, waterlogged ground. The structure remains standing for a long time, even as cracks spiderweb across the walls and doors begin to stick in their frames. The inhabitants might patch the plaster and prop up the sagging beams, but the underlying problem only deepens with each passing season. This is the slow unraveling of a civilization. It is a process where a society's ability to cope is gradually exhausted, where its reserves of food, unity, and hope are consumed day by uneventful day. This shift in understanding is everything. It moves us away from a simplistic search for a killer, a single cause of death like an invasion or an earthquake, and forces us to ask much deeper questions about a society's long-term health. How resilient were its institutions? How flexible was its economy? How deep was the loyalty of its people when the central authority could no longer provide security or sustenance? The collapse of the Hittites becomes a case study in systemic failure, a lesson in how a complex society, when pushed past its environmental and social limits, can simply come undone thread by thread. The real drama lies not in a final battle, but in the quiet, cumulative weight of 1,000 minor crises. This was a mystery no single scholar could have solved alone. The true breakthrough in understanding the Hittite collapse did not come from a lone historian in an archive or a solitary archaeologist in a trench. It was the result of a profound collaboration, a conversation between disciplines that had long been speaking different languages. Historians provided the context from the clay tablets, the names of kings, and the terms of treaties. Archaeologists uncovered the physical reality on the ground, the empty granaries and the peacefully abandoned streets. But it was the scientists, the dendrochronologists reading tree rings, and the climatologists decoding lake mud, who provided the crucial environmental evidence that made sense of it all. Each piece of the puzzle was essential, yet meaningless on its own. The historian's timeline was a list of events without a cause. The archaeologist's empty city was a crime scene without a motive. The scientist's drought data was a natural phenomenon without a human story. Only when these fragments were brought together did the complete, devastating picture finally snap into focus. This fusion of the humanities and the sciences has fundamentally rewritten a chapter of human history. It proves that the grandest questions about our past cannot be confined within the walls of a single academic department. The story of civilization is not just a story of kings and battles, nor is it merely a story of climate and weather. It is the intricate, fragile interplay between the two. This case study stands as a powerful testament to the power of connective thinking. It shows us that to see the full picture of where we come from, we must be willing to break down the silos that separate different forms of knowledge, uniting the story told by artifacts with the story written into the very fabric of the natural world. This science of tree ring dating, known as Dendrochronology, transformed a historical mystery into a solvable case. The method is deceptively simple, yet its precision is breathtaking. A tree does not simply grow, it meticulously journals its life, inscribing a new entry with every passing year. In a season of plentiful rain and mild temperatures, the tree thrives, adding a thick, robust ring of new wood. But when the rains fail and the sun scorches the land, growth slows to a crawl, leaving behind only a thin, pinched line, a desperate scrawl from a hungry year. To read these rings is to hold a direct annual report on the ancient climate. But how do you read a report from a tree that fell 3 millennia ago? The genius lies in pattern matching. Scientists begin by coring living ancient junipers, trees that are centuries old themselves, to establish a reliable modern baseline. Then they seek out preserved timber from archaeological sites, beams from long-collapsed Hittite palaces, and even charcoal from ancient hearths. By carefully sanding the cross-sections of these old samples until the rings stand out in stark relief, they can see the same pattern of wide and narrow rings. The final step is like assembling a massive, branching jigsaw puzzle through time. They overlap the patterns. The unique sequence of thick and thin rings from a recently fallen log will share its early pattern with the later pattern from an older beam. By linking these overlapping sequences one after another, they can stretch the climatic record back, year by exact year, deep into the Bronze Age. This chain of evidence is unbreakable, a continuous timeline woven from the fibers of the forest itself. It is this living archive that provided the first undeniable physical testimony. The rings did not show a temporary dry spell. They revealed a brutal, unyielding trend, a succession of desperately narrow lines that told of a land slowly dying of thirst, year after punishing year, precisely when the Hittite Empire needed rain the most. But to confirm the drought, scientists needed a second witness, one buried deep beneath the surface of ancient lakes. They turned to the silent, layered history books of the earth itself, sediment cores. Picture extracting a long, vertical tube of mud from the bottom of a still lake. This core is not just dirt, it is a timeline, with each fine layer representing a single year's accumulation of silt, pollen, and the microscopic remains of life. It is a climate archive written in mud. The real detective work, however, lies in reading the chemistry trapped within these layers. Scientists analyze the ratio of two different types of oxygen atoms, or isotopes, locked in the minuscule shells of long-dead creatures. Think of these isotopes as siblings with slightly different weights. Oxygen-16 is the lighter, more common one. Oxygen-18 is its heavier, less common counterpart. Here is the crucial clue. When water evaporates from a lake, the lighter oxygen-16 molecules escape more easily into the air, like a child who is quick to run off. The heavier oxygen-18 molecules tend to stay behind in the water. During a prolonged drought, with constant evaporation and little new rain to replenish the lake, the remaining water becomes increasingly enriched with this heavy oxygen-18. The tiny organisms living in the lake then incorporate this chemically distinct water into their shells. When they die, their shells, carrying that heavy oxygen signature, settle to the bottom and become part of the sediment layer for that year. So, when scientists find a layer in the core with a high ratio of oxygen-18 to oxygen-16, they are looking at a direct geochemical fingerprint of a parched landscape. It is a permanent record of a thirsty lake, a year when the skies withheld their rain. This data from the lake beds did not just echo the story of the tree rings, it screamed it in perfect unison, providing irrefutable physical proof that the Hittite world was quite literally drying up around them. The final clues to this ancient collapse were not found in grand temples or royal tombs, but in the microscopic residues left on the humblest of objects. A broken piece of pottery discarded 3,000 years ago can now tell us exactly what its owner ate or drank in their final days. This is the power of archaeological science. Through residue analysis, scientists wash these ancient shards with solvents that pull out invisible chemical traces, the ghostly imprints of long-vanished contents. A pottery jar that once held olive oil will retain the chemical signature of that oil even after millennia. A container for grain leaves behind its own distinct fingerprint. At Hittite settlements dating to the empire's final century, these tests reveal a telling sequence. early pots show rich residues of wine, olive oil, and diverse grains, evidence of a varied and prosperous diet. But as the decades of drought wore on, the residues change. The evidence for oil and wine fades away, leaving only the stark signature of grain. And then, in the very last layers, even that residue disappears. The pots are found scrubbed clean or containing nothing but the chemical echo of desperation. This is the silent, scientific confirmation of the empty granaries, a story of slow starvation written molecule by molecule on common kitchenware. It tells us that the state's collapse was not an abstract political event, but a personal, grinding reality felt in every home, at every meal. The people were not just hungry, they were systematically consuming every last calorie, down to the final drop of oil and the last kernel of wheat. Beyond the pots, the very earth they trod tells a parallel story. Soil chemistry analysis around former farmsteads shows a dramatic decline in key nutrients like phosphates and nitrates, the very elements that signal intensive, productive agriculture. The soil itself became exhausted, not from overuse, but from a lack of the replenishing manure and crop rotation that a functioning society requires. The land was simply given up, left to return to dust and scrub. These tiny, scientific details converge into a heartbreakingly intimate portrait. We are no longer just looking at a fallen empire, but at a family slowly eating through their last supplies, watching their fields turn barren, and finally, making the agonizing decision to walk away from a home that could no longer sustain them. How many such quiet tragedies had to unfold before an entire civilization simply ceased to be? The true depth of this collapse is measured not in fallen walls, but in the broken bodies and shattered lives of millions. A drought lasting generations did more than just kill crops. It systematically dismantled human health and social trust. Year after year of failed harvests meant that the most basic sustenance vanished. Malnutrition became the grim norm, weakening immune systems and turning common childhood illnesses into death sentences. A simple infection or a bout of diarrhea, easily survivable in a well-fed person, could become a fatal crisis for a body already consuming its own muscle for energy. Epidemics would have spread like wildfire through these vulnerable, densely populated communities, with grandparents, parents, and children succumbing in swift succession. The social fabric woven over centuries tore under this strain. Your neighbor was no longer a friend, but a competitor for the last sack of grain. Trust evaporated, replaced by a desperate, feral instinct for survival. The heart-wrenching decision to walk away from the land of your ancestors was not made lightly. It was the final, agonizing choice when staying meant watching your family starve to death before your eyes. This was not a political transition, it was a slow-motion human catastrophe, a generational trauma whose silent echoes we are only now beginning to hear. This new understanding of the Hittites represents a fundamental rewrite of the historical rulebook. For centuries, our view of the ancient world was shaped almost entirely by the stories that survived in writing. We relied on the boastful inscriptions of kings, the meticulous records of scribes, and the chronicles of the last civilization standing. This text-based history naturally emphasized human drama, the great battles, the ambitious rulers, and the political treaties. It was a narrative driven by names and dates, by the conscious decisions of powerful people. But what happens when the scribes fall silent, when the last king dies without an heir to record his demise? The old methods hit a dead end, leaving only a void filled with speculation about invaders and internal strife. The scientific evidence from trees and lakes has flooded that void with a completely different kind of light. It forces us to acknowledge that the most powerful forces in history are not always the ones that leave behind written proclamations. The climate does not issue a declaration of war. A drought does not carve its intentions into a clay tablet. These are silent, background processes that had been relegated to the footnotes of history until now. The fall of the Hittites demonstrates that environmental factors are not just a backdrop for the human story, they are often the main plot. This is a true paradigm shift, moving us from a history of great men to a history of complex systems, where the temperature of the ocean and the path of a storm cloud can be as consequential as the movement of an army. The story of the Hittites is no longer a simple tale of a kingdom that vanished. It has become a foundational case study, a stark lesson in the vulnerability of human complexity to the raw power of the natural world. This revelation is now rippling out, forcing historians to re-examine every other mysterious collapse in the archaeological record with a new set of questions. What if the Maya were not defeated by war, but by a changing climate they could not control? What if the enigmatic end of the Indus Valley civilization was written not in forgotten languages, but in the shifting sands of ancient rivers? The silent killer that stalked the Hittites may have had many other victims, and we are only just beginning to hear its story. This new evidence rewrites the calendar of catastrophe entirely. The fall was not a date on a stone tablet, but a slow, agonizing century. The timeline of collapse begins not with a battle, but with the first desperate year of the Mega-Drought around 1200 BC. This was year zero of the end. For the first decade, the empire's vast reserves and bureaucratic machinery would have held the line. The king could open the granaries, issue rationing orders, and project an image of control. But as the dry years stretched into 20, then 30, the system began to buckle under a weight it was never designed to bear. The central government, once the great provider, transformed into a desperate supplicant, demanding grain from provinces that had none to give. Its authority, built on the ability to protect and provision, evaporated in the heat. Outlying territories fighting for their own survival stopped listening. The empire did not shatter, it frayed at the edges, its borders shrinking inward year by hungry year. This makes the final abandonment of Hattusa around 1180 BC not a sudden event but a formality. It was the last administrative act of a ghost government, the moment the last official turned out the lights in a capital that had long since ceased to function as the heart of an empire. The city was not killed, it was starved of purpose, its population and power already bled away into the hinterlands. Understanding this extended 100-year process changes everything about how we view civilizational failure. We are conditioned to look for the single, dramatic explosion, the volcanic eruption that ends a society. The Hittite collapse was not an explosion. It was a slow leak, a tire going flat over a very long, very painful journey. The final hiss of air escaping the capital was merely the sound of the journey ending. The fall of the Hittites is a profound testament to an inescapable truth, that the story of humanity is forever entwined with the power of the natural world. For centuries, their disappearance was a ghost story, a cautionary tale lost in the fog of time. But science has given that ghost a voice, and the story it tells is not one of mythical invaders, but of a very real and familiar adversary, a changing climate. This is not merely an academic revelation. It is a clear-eyed warning from the past, a demonstration of how environmental shifts can systematically dismantle the most sophisticated societies. The silent siege that starved their empire is a stark lesson in vulnerability, showing us that walls of stone are no defense against a shifting sky. Their collapse holds up a mirror to our own global civilization, challenging us to see the same patterns of interdependence and fragility in our own world. We are now the stewards of a planet whose climate we are actively altering, and the Hittite experience begs the question: are we building a society more resilient than theirs, or one that is even more complex and brittle? As we continue to decipher the secrets of the ancient world, let us carry this lesson forward not as a relic, but as a responsibility. Their fate can be our guide, urging us to build a future founded on resilience, foresight, and a deep, abiding respect for the delicate balance of our planet.